So I'd like to talk about what mindfulness is. Jon Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness is what nowadays seems to be accepted as the norm in our Western culture. Awareness of the present moment on purpose in a particular way, non-judgmentally. And I think it's very important to understand that Jon Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness reflected his Korean Zen Buddhist non-dual approach, non-dual, non-judgmental. He wanted to bring mindfulness into Western culture, and his attempt was to secularize it and remove it of any of its religiosity. And he created what was called MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And this was an attempt to bring mindfulness to the management of chronic pain for patients. We have to understand mindfulness in the context of what came before it. In the Buddhist times, the original word for mindfulness was the Pali word sati, S-A-T-I. And that word meant to remember. Remember to be attentive to what was there in the present moment, and to remember to bring the insights and learnings that you had to the present moment. Mindfulness historically was an attempt to end suffering, and mindfulness did not exist independent of ethical action. It was in the late 1800s that a British Pali scholar named Rhys Davids coined the word mindfulness for the Pali word sati. And mindfulness to him was the translation for attention or awareness. Historic Buddhist Theravada tradition, importantly, had discernment, had judgment as a very important part of the understanding of mindfulness. The question was, is what was present in this moment skillful? And how does one act skillfully? So it's very important to recognize that historic Buddhist understanding of mindfulness was very judgmental, but judgmental to act in a skillful way. And this is very different than Jon Kabat-Zinn's definition of acting non-judgmentally. The Buddhists compared mindfulness as a gatekeeper. With mindfulness as his gatekeeper, the disciple of the noble ones abandons what is unskillful, develops what is skillful, abandons what is blameworthy, develops what is blameless, and looks after himself with purity. Judgment, discernment was a key component of mindfulness. In our current iteration of mindfulness, today it seems to be all about enhanced awareness and a therapeutic strategy to reduce stress, anxiety, and depression. You know, one can see that there is no uniform definition of mindfulness, and it seems to be appropriated by the culture it lives in. My own sense about our current understanding of mindfulness is that it really minimizes, it trivializes the significance and importance of what mindfulness can offer us. Pain and suffering does not come from the event. It is our relationship with it. And mindfulness is a relationship with the present moment in order to act in a skillful way. It is not freedom from pain and suffering. The essence is, it is the freedom to be with pain, and suffering. We will never have a mind that is still of thought, except if you are dead or in a coma. And that is not the intent of mindfulness. My understanding of mindfulness is it is an engaged discernment leading to non-attachment and skillful action. Engaged discernment leading to non-attachment and skillful action. So let's explore this further. And I think that if one looks at mindfulness in an overarching scheme, it's all about awareness, insight into the true nature of reality and the true nature of self, and relationship and response. It is the AIR, A-I-R, of life. So how do we, in a very practical way, actualize mindfulness? And I would ask you to keep the acronym WAIT, W-A-I-T, in mind when you are in relationship with the present moment. And WAIT really exemplifies these components of AIR. WAIT stands for, what am I thinking? What am I touching? Why am I thinking this? And what am I trying to do? So let's explore each one of this. So when you are in relationship with the present moment, the first thing to say to yourself simply is wait. And the significance of that is that it reminds you to take a mindful pause, to take a break from this automatic, autonomous, instantaneous, spontaneous unfolding of an unconscious, reactive, conditioned pattern. So say wait. Remind yourself to pause. Let's now look at the first component. What am I thinking? And this really reflects the aspect of awareness. What do I know? What am I aware of? They say we have 60,000 thoughts a day. 90% of them are of the past or the future, but we are only present 47% of the time. So I say it can be very helpful to smile to awareness. Intentional and sustained meta-awareness, label and evoke awareness. SMILE as an acronym to try and remember to bring awareness to the present moment. Normally, our awareness is what is called stimulus-driven. Whatever is predominant in the moment is what we are aware of. But we need to change that approach. There needs to be an intentional and sustained awareness. We need to be able to hold what we are dealing with in an attempt to examine it and have choice. And more importantly, awareness in mindfulness is what is called meta-awareness. That means to know what you know. When we get angry, we are just angry. Do you know that you're angry? Not at all. We experience what is called experiential fusion. In other words, we are identified completely with our experience. We are unified. So what we need to know is not I am angry, but I know that I am angry. And so one of the best and simplest and easiest ways to anchor yourself into the present moment, to anchor yourself into meta-awareness, to anchor yourself into some distancing from what is grabbing you, is to label. In other words, to name your experience. And in order to name your experience, you have had to be able to step back from being owned by it, and in order to have some degree of reflection of what is happening. So this simply involves saying, now thinking, now feeling, or in a more specific way, now sadness, now pain. And if one was going to take this a little further, one could come to it from a third person perspective. You really want to avoid the statement of, I am sad, because what this does is it sets up the idea that there is a sense of self that you identify with. When you use the third person perspective, what you've done is you've stepped back from the self and identification. Now Phil is sad. Now Phil is angry. And if one was going to even take this one step further, there could actually be a description of what's going on from a third person perspective. So I sort of look at this as going to the movies. Are you going to sit in the audience and observe what's going to happen? Or are you going to identify with the actors that are on the screen? So the way you do this is, I lose my keys, I get upset. So in your mind, you step back, you pause, and you say, Philip lost his keys. Philip is now angry. He's worried, he's concerned, he's angry at himself. So that capacity to step back, to witness, allows one to be aware, allows one to bring meta-awareness, and it helps to promote that capacity to step back and not identify. The last component of what am I thinking is, can you evoke awareness? I'd be aware all the time if I could only remember to be aware all the time. And as we said, we're really only aware 47% of the time. So what can be very helpful is to use cues to remind yourself to be mindful. One could put an alarm on their watch. There are mindfulness apps that remind you, or you can have Post-it notes on your house. The other way is to choose physical cues, such that when you do an activity, this is the cue, the reminder to say, what am I doing? So for example, before you send an email or after you send an email, pause. What's going on right now? Before you answer the phone or after you answer the phone? Before you eat? While you're at a stoplight? So the first component of wait is, what am I thinking? Intentional and sustained awareness. Label your experience. This is the simplest and most effective way to start your mindfulness practice. If you are not aware of what's happening, you can never be in a conscious relationship with it. And use cues in order to ground yourself into your awareness. The next component of wait is, what am I touching? In other words, what am I engaged with in this moment? Our normal response to pain and suffering is to run away, is to deny it, is to flee. Our normal response is not to turn towards our pain and say, let me have some more pain here. Let me engage it more. When we think, we're typically in the past and the future. But there are two ways to ground yourself into the present moment. And that is your breath and your body. our thoughts and emotions are expressed in our body. And trauma that existed even before we had language is trapped and held in our body. So coming into the body will ground you into the present moment. So where does your tension live in your body? What is your characteristic way of feeling your tension? So what can you do in order to get into your body? So normally we hold our tension in our face and our torso and our shoulders. So what you want to do when you bring your attention to your body is to come to the neutral parts of the body that allow you to be grounded and regulated. You want to go as far away as you can from the spot that's hot. So those places are the contact of your feet on the floor, the contact of your buttocks on the cushion, and your hands as they are usually in relationship to your body. So the first thing you do is you bring yourself into contact in your body in those places that allow you to ground and to settle. And when you feel that you are settled, you now can gradually bring your awareness up your body and try and get as close as you can to the spot that has the most tension. For some people, this is impossible because, as I said, we hold our trauma in our bodies. And when we get close to that physical spot, it often will trigger these unrecognizable memories of our previously held trauma. So the suggestion is start where you are grounded, come as close as you can to the hot spot. If you can just dip your toe into it, that's fine. And then you need to run back to that place of neutrality and groundedness, that's fine. So often the way one can almost operate is that there is this sort of oscillating movement where you stay in groundedness. You come as close as you can to the hot spot, and then you come back to your groundedness. This is a wonderful way to engage with interest and curiosity the present moment. So one can do this process until that energetic moment has been discharged, 5 minutes, 5 breaths, because there's really something very special about resting in the somatic experience of pain and suffering. That our bodies have this unbelievable, magical capacity to metabolize this pain and suffering and to allow it to move through you and be released. Because our normal tendency is to put a wall up to our pain when we never discharge it. And when we start to allow that capacity for our trauma to move through our bodies, it slowly starts to become released. And there's one very other important aspect in terms of bringing your awareness to the physical expression of thoughts and feelings and self. You know, the reason why we don't go to our fear, to our thoughts and our feelings is because it evokes such tremendous fear. But when you're actually able to turn toward it and see what it truly is, it's not so fearful. I liken it to the Wizard of Oz. When you pull the curtain down, what do you see? In our case, it's a frightened little child. So it's very important to turn to the body, ground yourself into the present moment, see what the truth is of our thoughts and feelings and self. And lastly, stay with the sensation, sustain the sensation until you surrender into stillness. And why that is important is because it is a very clear example of the impermanence of all of our experiences. When you can sit in it and watch it and see how it changes and see how it ends, this is true confirmation of the impermanence of all existence. And the other way you can bring yourself into the present moment is to bring yourself to your breath. What happens to you when you get upset or tense or stressed out? What happens to your breath? Well, probably you notice that it becomes a little shallow, becomes fast, it becomes tight. And where do you breathe from? Your chest. So how do you bring awareness to the breath as a way to help stabilize you and bring you into the present moment? Our breath is under dual control, conscious and automatic. Thank goodness it's automatic, or we would all be dead because we forget to breathe. So the first aspect is one could simply bring one's awareness to the breath and just watch it and let it breathe spontaneously. The other way to use the breath to regulate the nervous system is to do what I call the ABCDE of breathing. A, bring awareness to your breath, focus on it. B, C, breathe calmly. So what you're doing is you are consciously breathing in and away to calm yourself. How do you breathe calmly? Well, we all know you breathe slowly, deeply, and smoothly. Next, D, diaphragm. When we come into this world, we are all belly breathers. With life and stress, a lot of us turn into chest breathers. When you can breathe from your diaphragm, your belly, you are stimulating the vagus nerve, which is intimately related to the relaxation response. So I invite you right now, put your hand on your belly and put your hand on your chest. And then just breathe and notice what hand rises when you breathe in. Is it your belly or your chest? And now, can you consciously direct your breathing so that you breathe from your belly? So consciously make the effort to breathe from your belly as you breathe in and not from your chest. And you can consciously retrain yourself to become a belly breather. The last component of breathing is E, and E stands for exhalation. So you have to understand physiologically, when we breathe out, this supports the parasympathetic nervous system or the relaxation response. And when we breathe in, this supports the sympathetic nervous system or the fight or flight response. So therefore, it makes sense that if you can breathe out longer than you can breathe in, you are going to promote relaxation. So what I'd ask you to do right now is to start to count your breaths. How many seconds do you breathe in? And how many seconds do you breathe out? And now I would like you to make a conscious effort such that you always breathe out at least 1 second longer than you breathe in. And this can ultimately lead to what is called as slow breathing, where one breathes 4 to 6 breaths a minute, as opposed to the conventional 12 to 16 breaths a minute. So whenever you are faced with a charged moment, you can't talk to yourself. You can't communicate with yourself. You can't dialogue with yourself to settle yourself down. And the reason why is that there's a part of your brain called the thalamus that regulates the passage of information from your body to your brain. And it shuts down and your brain goes offline. So the only way you can communicate with your brain when you are upset is to go to your breath or your body. This is the simplest thing and the most effective thing you can do. So when you get charged, go to a neutral part of your body, slowly ascend to the hot spot, and if you need to, oscillate back and forth. Bring your awareness to your breath, and in that moment, put your hand on your belly and count your breath. And so use your breath and your body as the easiest, most effective way to stabilize an activated, charged nervous system. So next in the acronym of WAIT is, why am I thinking this? And this is essential. In order to understand why we do, we need to understand why we do what we do in order to be able to release it. We need to understand the true nature of reality and, importantly, the true nature of self. So, what's a judgment? You know, this is an important part of Jon Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness, non-judgmentally. Well, a judgment simply is a decision, an opinion that you make based on the facts. So, is judgment a normal function? Is it something that's bad? Well, absolutely not. You know, we evaluate and judge everything. And there is a really important reason why we do that. Because how do we know what to do if we don't know the significance of what has just happened? Understanding the meaning of the current event informs us how we need to respond to the next event. So judgment is normal. Judgment is essential. Well, so why is judgment so problematic? I lose my keys. And in that moment, I might say, you know, I lost my keys. You know, this could be a problem. Well, what do I need to do? Well, let me think. You know what? I last had my keys in my office. I think I better go back to my office and look there. Or I get into an argument with a colleague and he starts to get angry and yells. And I can sort of step back and reflect and say, you know, what's going on here? What's charging this person? You know, there's something going on behind this that we need to discover. So both of these are examples of a skillful judgment, the capacity to be present without creating suffering. Or I could lose my keys and my mind could say, oh, Philip, you are just ridiculous. This is the worst thing in the world. This is terrible. You know what? You're so careless. You know, you're never going to be able to find those keys. You're never going to be able to drive that car again. Or I get into argument with my colleague and I just get into it with him as well. And we're shouting, and we're yelling, and we're throwing things. Skillful? Not really. So, what makes the difference between something being a skillful and an unskillful judgment? If you look at those two examples, what comes up is this. An action happens. It is evaluated. This is bad. But then what happens next is that there is a sense of self that now comes into the predicament. So now what happens is, this is bad, translates into I am bad. Self-worth is dependent upon action. We as humans are of two minds. We have the capacity to be aware, and we have the capacity to rest in the self. What normally happens is that when our minds create something for us and we become aware of it, what's our instinct? Hey, if my mind's talking to me, that must be me. And if there is a sense of I that is angry, I must be that I that is angry. Our normal, instinctive human reaction is for awareness to identify with the sense of self. That what knows and what is known become one in the same. That we lose the capacity to rest in awareness that knows there is an experience that contains the story of self, as opposed to being the self that is having the story. It is our identification with the sense of self that leads to suffering. So, we can make a judgment. That's normal. Ideally, it would be better if we could make skillful rather than unskillful judgments. We create a sense of self because we need it to function in this world. Whether or not you make a judgment, skillful or unskillful, whether or not you have a sense of self, those two are not the issues. The issue of freedom is whether you identify with the sense of self, whether you rest in awareness or in the self. The essence of mindfulness is not awareness, important, but not the essence. The essence of mindfulness is not to be non-judgmental. The freedom point of mindfulness is non-attachment, disidentification with the sense of self. I think this is one of the biggest problems we encounter with mindfulness today. Whenever we ask people what mindfulness is, it's awareness of the present moment, to be non-judgmental. But there is never a discussion about the fact that it is our relationship with self, it is our identification with self that is the crux for our suffering and the segue to freedom. So let's explore this sense of self and how we can disidentify with it. And I acknowledge the fact that this really can be a very difficult thing to do. I've been doing this practice for years, and it's taken a long time until I have had some true sense of understanding. When the Buddha talked about the essence of experience, he talked that there were three characteristics. Nothing is permanent, that the sense of self is a construct, causes and conditions coming together in the present moment to create a sense of self. And that if you were to try and grab onto something, hoping that it would last, or identify with a sense of self, that would lead to suffering. Unbelievable. This was 2,600 years ago. And he had the insight to understand that anything you attach to as me or mine leads to suffering. Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. But I had some difficulty in understanding this and really truly experientially feeling it. And so I want to share with you a technique that I have discovered that has allowed me to more clearly understand how I create myself and how I can disidentify. And this is through the capacity, the integration of Western psychological thought about the origin of self. And then with that understanding, having the capacity to rest in mindfulness, to be able to be with self, but not be the self. And I call this cognitive mindfulness, not mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So let's examine this sense of self. Do all of you have an identity? Absolutely. We all have an ego. We all have a sense of who we are. We all have an I, because that's the way we're made. And because how could we function in this world without a sense of self? Let's examine how we create this sense of self. Because you don't come into this world with this sense of, hey, I'm born, I'm Phil. Our identities is what is thrust upon us and what we create. That we come into this world as defenseless creatures that are very dependent upon our caregivers to make us feel safe, loved, and worthy. That our actions are all for the intent of a biologic survival. We need to live in this world, and that is a biologic imperative. So we create a belief system about who we are that is contingent with our attachment with our caregivers initially. If they treat me like I am cherished, like I am loved, like I am cared for, then you know what? I'm going to have good, positive attachment with my caregivers. And I am going to have a sense about who I am that is positive. If I come into this world and my caregivers treat me in a way that I am not loved, that I am not cherished, then this is going to believe who I am. Because you see, we carry what is called a burden of badness, that we believe we are responsible for how people treat us when we are young. And so we create a belief system of who we are to keep us safe, loved, and worthy that is unique for each of us, dependent upon our relationship with our caregivers. We create an autobiographical sense of self by age 4. By age 4, we already are having an identity. And in order for us to cope with our sense of inadequacies, we develop coping strategies. And often this gets played out as self-soothing addictive behavior. Our addiction to sex, drugs, alcohol, work, exercise, gaming, gambling. All of these are our unconscious attempts to self-soothe, to feel safe, loved, and worthy. So what happens is that our minds are meaning-making machines. The sense of self is just a label that we are placing over our belief system and who we believe we are and our inner child wounding. I lose my keys. And my mind says to me, Philip, boy, oh boy, you blew it. This is terrible. How could you do that? This is the worst thing in the world. Action is bad. Self-worth is tied to action. I am bad. But you have to understand that this goes beyond the aspect of me losing the keys and not driving my car. This really penetrates much deeper. And this touches my core wounding. That every moment we experience triggers a historic memory of who we are and how we are in this world. When I grew up in my house, my mother ruled the house, and it was her way or the highway. But you have to understand that she came just before the Second World War, that her father died when she was 2, and that her elder brother died at 13, who I think was almost like a surrogate father. So she lived with the fear of loss. And it was very important for her to have control over her life. And this reflected in my belief system, that I recognized that it wasn't about me, that everything was dependent about her, that my action needed to be one of please or appease, that I needed to be invisible, that I couldn't stand up for myself. And so when I lost my keys, you have to understand that I am no different than anyone else, that triggered a memory that I had made a mistake, that I was not perfect. And in order for me to feel safe, and safe meant accepted, and I confused acceptance with love, I needed to be perfect. So this may be a very banal, sort of simple example, but it reflects the fact that every single moment we examine what has happened against our belief system. And when you have an understanding of what your core wounding is, when you understand how your sense of self is based on this wounding and how it manifests every moment, and when you can see how the sense of self is a construct, then this gives you the capacity to realize this is all made up. Why do I need to identify with it? And in understanding that gave me the freedom to let go of the sense of self. And so this is the whole topic into itself. And very briefly, I would just like you to come back to understanding who you are. But first of all, be very careful that if you think in any way reliving your childhood would re-traumatize you, don't do this experiment. But I would just ask you to close your eyes for a second. And we don't want to relive experience, we just want to understand our experience. How would you describe yourself as a child? And how would others describe you? And what did you believe about yourself? And what was your fear? And what did you need from your parents and did not get? And what was your coping strategy? How did you act in order to feel safe in your environment? And so the reason in doing this experiment is to truly get an understanding of really what is calling to be heard in each moment. That who we are is not our sense of self, but it is this underlying truth of our need to satisfy our unmet needs. And so in that moment, simply asking yourself, who is calling to be heard, is a reminder that what is going on is your inner child calling. And in understanding that gives you the capacity to understand the true nature of self and the true nature of reality. that allows for non-attachment. So let's come to the last component of wait, and that is, what am I trying to do? You know, all the current definitions of mindfulness are statements of negation, not affirmation, of how one is being, not how one is doing. And I think the current definitions of mindfulness, unfortunately, minimalize and trivialize the richness of mindfulness. You see, it is in understanding the true nature of self that one can act from a place of not having to defend the self. And this is a wonderful segue into connecting with something that is very divine and sacred in being human. One's innate wisdom, one's innate compassion that allows one to be present in each moment with wisdom and skillfulness. It gives us the capacity for choice. As Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response is a space. And in that space is choice. And in choice, there is freedom. So when you are ready to respond and hopefully not react to a moment, ask yourself, what is my aim? A, is my behavior to be altruistic for the benefit of others? As a mutually responsive response. I, what is the intentionality behind what I want to do? And we carry multiple intentions, which is fine, but can you choose the most skillful one? And M stands for morality, ethics. What is the aim in my response? How do I choose it? Altruistically, intentionality, and with morality. So, mindfulness is about engaged discernment, leading to non-attachment and skillful action. That it is a process, not a state that you reach. That it is the capacity not to be free from pain and suffering, but the capacity to have the freedom to be with pain and suffering. Thank you.